The idea of Stairway was to have a piece of music, a composition, whereby it would just keep unfolding into more more layers and more moods, and actually the whole intensity of or subtlety and the intensity of the overlay of the composition would actually.
At 81 years old, Jimmy Page sits quietly in the shadows of his own legend. The man who built Stairway to Heaven like a sonic cathedral once said he wanted a piece of music that unfolded layer after layer, rising in intensity until it swallowed the whole room. For decades, the world worshipped that genius, without ever suspecting what he was really holding back. He wasn't just the mastermind behind Led Zeppelin, he was the quiet architect of an entire era of rock. But behind the studio doors, behind the roaring crowds and the guitar solos that shook arenas, Jimmy Page carried something much darker than anyone imagined. Resentment, betrayal, and a list of guitarists he could never forgive. These weren't harmless rivalries or playful feuds for the tabloids. These were men he played with, drank with, and shared stages with. Men the public thought were his brothers in music, but in Page's private world, some of them became ghosts he refused to acknowledge, names he refused to say out loud until now. One smirk in a smoky London club, one stolen drummer in a quiet studio, one blazing guitar set on fire in front of a shocked crowd, one dismissive comment that reduced his life's work to just noise. Each moment dug a little deeper into Page's pride, turning admiration into bitterness and respect into something that felt a lot like hate. Tonight, we're not talking about riffs, solos, or record sales. We're going inside the unspoken wars behind the amplifiers, the moments when Jimmy Page realized certain legends were no longer friends, but enemies he'd never truly make peace with. Some of the names on this list will surprise you. Some are icons people assumed he admired, and yet in private he saw them as rivals, thieves, mockers, or living reminders of everything he didn't want to become. From the chosen one, whose fans wrote his name on London's walls, to the wild American who made everyone else sound careful, to the minimalist critic who called Led Zeppelin a bit of a joke, to the blazing prodigy who made Page feel obsolete overnight. These are the 6 guitarists Jimmy Page quietly grew to despise, and the stories behind each broken bond are far darker than the public ever knew. Stay with me, because once you hear how it started with one simple joke in a London club, you'll never look at these rock legends the same way again. It all began with a name Jimmy Page could never escape. The man fans called God. It always comes back to one name. Before the arenas, before the myth, before Led Zeppelin, there was Eric Clapton. In 1960s London, Clapton wasn't just a guitarist, he was a religion. Fans sprayed 3 words on brick walls and train stations all over the city: Clapton is God. Jimmy Page watched that happen in real time. While Clapton was being worshipped in public, Page was buried in the studio sessions, playing on other people's records, building a reputation in the shadows. The world saw Clapton. Musicians knew Page. And somewhere between those two truths, a quiet resentment started to form inside him. One night, in a London club, everything crystallized. Clapton was on stage, absolutely tearing through a solo. The room was packed, bodies pressed so close to the amps that every note shook their ribs. Sweat clung to the ceiling, and the crowd screamed his name like a battle cry. Page stood off to the side, half hidden in the darkness, just another musician watching. As the solo ended and the applause exploded, Clapton looked up and slowly scanned the room. His eyes landed on Jimmy Page. For a brief second, the noise seemed to fade away. Clapton didn't wave. He didn't nod. He just gave a tiny smirk, a small, knowing look that seemed to say, without a single word, "I'm the one on the stage. You're the one in the shadows." For everyone else, it was nothing. For Jimmy Page, it was the start of a rivalry that would never really cool down. That tension found its battlefield in a band that would shape both their lives, the Yardbirds. In March 1965, Clapton walked out of the Yardbirds. He was furious that the band was drifting toward pop hits instead of pure blues. To him, it felt like a betrayal of everything he believed in. He didn't just leave quietly. In clubs and backstage corners, people heard him complain about the band's new direction and how the soul of the music was being traded for chart success. In the middle of that chaos, Jimmy Page stepped into the picture. At first, he was the trusted session ally, the man called in when the studio needed something special. Then he became a member, slowly intertwining himself with the group Clapton had once called his own. As the Yardbirds moved toward more experimental sounds and bigger stages, Clapton watched from the outside, feeling as if his band, his sound, had been twisted into something he no longer recognized. What cut even deeper was the reaction of the crowd. The same people who had once worshipped Clapton is God were now raving about the mysterious new guitarist with the layered tones and strange ideas. Jimmy Page, the man from the shadows, was suddenly the one everyone was talking about. Jimmy Page had quietly been working on a powerful new concept with drummer Jim Gordon, an ambitious idea that would push rock into darker, more cinematic territory. Gordon was the heartbeat of that dream, the essential pulse behind the music Page heard in his head. Then Clapton stepped in once again. He approached Jim Gordon for his own plans, projects that would soon become part of Clapton's next legendary chapter. Gordon chose to go with Clapton. On paper, it was simple business, but to Page, it felt like someone had walked into his workshop and taken the instrument right out of his hands before the masterpiece was finished. The rivalry was no longer just about ego or reputation. Now it was personal. By 1968, Clapton's frustration transformed into something sharper, quiet mockery. During a BBC appearance, he was asked about the explosion of new guitar styles and the use of distortion, pedals, and swirling effects that bands like Led Zeppelin were beginning to unleash. Clapton shrugged and delivered a line that would sting Jimmy Page for years. Some players use effects when their fingers don't have much to say. He never spoke Jimmy Page's name. He didn't need to. Everyone understood who he was talking about, the guitarist building walls of sound with pedals, layering tracks, using alternate tunings, and echoing delays to create something huge and otherworldly. Clapton cast himself as the pure blues traditionalist. Page was painted as the sorcerer hiding behind technology. With one sentence, Clapton drew a sharp line between them. In private, Clapton could be even more dismissive about Led Zeppelin. In studio conversations and relaxed chats, including moments at Apple Studios, he would brush off their music as too loud, too excessive, all power and no real soul. For Jimmy Page, who poured every obsession, every sleepless night, and every fragment of himself into those songs, it felt like having his life's work tossed aside as nothing more than overblown noise. The bitterness finally surfaced in a quiet, tense way in 1975, backstage at Madison Square Garden. By then, both men were untouchable legends. Both knew exactly what the other had achieved, the history between them, the smirk in the club, the Yardbirds, Jim Gordon, the subtle jabs in interviews hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Jimmy Page walked into the room. Eric Clapton was already there. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouted argument, no emotional reconciliation. Just one long, heavy moment, and then a small, distant nod. Clapton acknowledged Page with the bare minimum, a cool and formal gesture that seemed to say, "We're not friends, we're not allies, we're just two men who survived the same storm." Whatever had started in those small London clubs in the 1960s had never fully healed, and at 81, looking back over the wreckage and the glory of those years, that old wound still lived just beneath the surface of the legend Jimmy Page had become. And Eric Clapton was only the beginning, because the next guitarist on Jimmy Page's secret list didn't just rival him, he set his instrument on fire. Number 2, Jimi Hendrix. The genius Jimmy Page never wanted to compete with. By late 1966, something in London's music world shifted. For years, when people whispered in dark clubs about guitar players, they talked about Jimmy Page, about his flawless session work, his strange ideas in the studio, his reputation as the silent weapon behind other artists' hits. But in the autumn of 1966, Page started hearing things he never wanted to hear. People weren't whispering about his latest sessions anymore. They were talking about an American, a left-handed guitarist who played his Stratocaster upside down, a man who bent notes until they screamed and fed his guitar into amplifiers like a wild animal on a leash, a name that kept coming up in every backstage conversation: Jimi Hendrix. Page never admitted it out loud, but the first time he heard the stories, jealousy hit him like a punch to the chest. One musician remembered seeing Page at the Cromwellian Club after another night of Hendrix chaos had torn through London. Word was spreading about Hendrix burning his guitar, smashing amps, turning concerts into something closer to a ritual than a show. Page listened in silence, staring off to the side, and finally muttered under his breath, "Right, that's where we're going now. Bonfires." People around him laughed, but Page didn't. London's club scene quickly turned into a battlefield of comparison. In rooms like the Scotch of St. James and the Speakeasy, fans and musicians argued in corners, drinks in hand, asking the same question over and over again: who's really the best now, Jimmy Page or Jimi Hendrix? Hendrix was the firestorm. Page was the architect. And the more Hendrix lit up the stage, the more Page felt years of quiet work being pushed into the shadows. According to music writer Charles Shaar Murray, Page later described Hendrix's performances in one simple, brutal image: fireworks, huge, dazzling, explosive. But to Page, not the kind of slow-burning craft he valued. It all came to a head in early 1969 when a journalist finally asked the question everyone had been dancing around for years: what did Jimmy Page think about Jimi Hendrix being labeled the greatest guitarist alive? This time, Page didn't hide behind politeness. He answered with a cool, cutting line that said everything without naming names. Some people like fireworks. To most listeners, it sounded casual, but to those who knew the history, the jealousy, the endless comparisons, it felt like a door slamming shut. As the years passed, Hendrix's legend only grew. His records became sacred texts for a younger generation, the generation that might once have worshipped Page as the ultimate guitar hero. Instead, many of them saw Hendrix as the one who rewrote the rules, and Page as the man standing in his shadow. When Hendrix died in 1970, London's music scene shook with grief. Clapton and other musicians spoke openly about their shock and admiration. Tributes poured in. Walls that had once said Clapton is God now quietly recognized Hendrix as something beyond comparison. Jimmy Page stayed distant. He didn't talk much. He didn't write long tributes. He let the storm pass around him in near silence. To outsiders, that silence was confusing. To those who had watched the rivalry unfold, it felt like the final chapter of a story that had started the moment Hendrix's name began echoing through London. A story of respect, yes, but also of being replaced in the eyes of an entire generation. Jimmy Page never needed to say that he hated Jimi Hendrix. The resentment lived in what he didn't say, in the way he dismissed the fireworks, and in how carefully he stepped around the man who had become his greatest living comparison. And Hendrix was only the second name on that list, because the next guitarist Jimmy Page shut out wasn't a firestorm. He was a stone-faced riff machine who believed Page's entire approach to guitar was a mistake. Number 3, Keith Richards. The clash Jimmy Page never really got over. This wasn't a feud born out of tabloid drama or one drunken argument. It came from pure irritation, and a clash of philosophy so sharp it almost felt personal from the very beginning. In late 1960s London, two bands were casting massive shadows over the city. The Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin were both dominating the scene, but for completely different reasons. Keith Richards lived by the church of simplicity. Raw chords, sharp riffs, a groove you could feel in your bones. He believed a guitar should be dirty, honest, and straight to the point. No smoke, no mirrors. If a song needed more than a handful of chords in his mind, something was already wrong. Jimmy Page was the opposite. He built sound like an architect builds a cathedral. Layer over layer, echo, effects, strange tunings, textures that turned a simple riff into a whole universe. To Page, the guitar wasn't just an instrument, it was a laboratory. Those two visions were always going to collide. The crack became obvious when an interviewer asked Keith Richards what he thought of Jimmy Page's playing on Dazed and Confused. Richards smirked and shot out a line that traveled across London in a matter of hours. Great player, shame he hides behind all that stuff. He didn't have to explain what stuff meant. To him, it was the echo, the effects, the layered tracks, all the studio sorcery that Page used to turn a riff into a storm. Richards thought it was unnecessary decoration. To Page, it was the entire point. Once that comment reached Jimmy Page, there was no way to unhear it. It wasn't just criticism. It was a rejection of the very thing that made him who he was. The tension only grew. In 1973, during a private NME listening session, Richards was played new Zeppelin material. He listened, expression unreadable, while other people in the room nodded along, impressed by the size and power of the sound. Then Richards broke the silence with another jab, something along the lines of all volume, no feeling, as if Zeppelin's monumental sound was nothing more than empty thunder. Word of that comment drifted back to Page, too. Every time, the same message was hiding underneath. You're clever, but you're doing it wrong. The coldest moment came 2 years later, backstage at Madison Square Garden in 1975. Several witnesses said Jimmy Page walked into a room just as Keith Richards was in mid-rant about modern rock bands, grumbling that some guitarists bury their riffs in effects, and drown them in echo. Page froze in the doorway. Everyone knew exactly who Richards was really talking about. Nobody said a word. Richards didn't look up. No one stepped in to introduce them or soften the moment. It was one of those silences so sharp, it felt like a slap. From that point on, Richards kept tossing little jabs in interviews, calling Zeppelin hollow or suggesting their songs were all flash and no heart. He played the role of the purist, the guardian of real rock and roll, while Page became, in his eyes, the overcomplicating magician. Jimmy Page never fired back publicly. He didn't start counterattacks in magazines, didn't mock the Stones, didn't send any insults back across the line. Instead, he quietly shut Richards out. He stopped going to events where the Stones might appear, avoided situations where they might be forced into the same room again, and treated the feud like a door he had locked from his side. Decades later, as many old rivalries softened into warm stories and shared nostalgia, this one never really thawed. Richards still couldn't resist small digs. Page still kept his distance. The clash between them wasn't just about two men, it was about two completely different beliefs about what the guitar should be. And Keith Richards was only the third name on Jimmy Page's private list, because the next guitarist didn't just irritate him, he made Jimmy Page feel like the entire world of guitar had suddenly shifted under his feet. Number 4, Eddie Van Halen, the prodigy who made Jimmy Page feel the ground shifting under his feet. By the end of the 1970s, Jimmy Page was already a living monument. He had done it all, remade rock, filled stadiums, turned guitar solos into spiritual events. Young players studied his every move, rewinding his riffs, slowing down his solos, trying to decode the magic he wove in the studio and on stage. Then, almost overnight, the language of the electric guitar changed. It didn't happen in London, it happened across the ocean in California in a band named after a guitarist whose very name would become a storm front, Eddie Van Halen. At first, Jimmy Page heard the same rumors everyone else did. There was this kid who played so fast it sounded impossible. This kid who tapped notes on the fretboard with both hands like a pianist, who made the guitar squeal, scream, and sing in ways nobody had quite heard before. Fans weren't just impressed, they were stunned. And like it or not, they started to draw comparisons. Reporters and young guitarists began saying things that cut deeper than they realized. Jimmy Page changed rock. Eddie Van Halen is changing the guitar itself. For a man whose identity was woven tightly into his instrument, that kind of talk felt like someone was quietly rewriting history while he was still alive. One story that circled among musicians placed Jimmy Page in a room with a Van Halen record spinning for the first time. Listen to this, someone supposedly said, dropping the needle on a track that would shake the world. Eruption. For just under 2 minutes, everything that had defined rock guitar seemed to evaporate into a blur of tapped notes, dive bombs, and liquid, effortless speed. The kind of piece that made even seasoned players lean in and ask themselves, how is he doing that? The room fell silent when the track ended. No one quite knew what to say. Some versions of the story claim Page nodded politely, a faint, distant smile on his lips, and offered a simple, guarded compliment, something neutral, something safe. But the heaviness in the air said more than any polite phrase ever could, because beneath the surface there was a deeper, more uncomfortable truth. Eddie Van Halen had just kicked open a door that Jimmy Page hadn't even known was there. Suddenly, guitar magazines were filled with diagrams of tapping patterns. Guitar shops were packed with kids trying to play like Eddie, not Page. Posters of Led Zeppelin's Mysteries were now sharing wall space with images of a grinning young guitarist in striped overalls, his Frankenstrat held like a weapon. The future had a new face. In interviews, Van Halen mentioned his influences. He spoke about Clapton, about past heroes, about the British invasion that had inspired him. He did not attack Jimmy Page. He did not speak with arrogance or disrespect. But every time a young player said, "My hero is Eddie," it chipped a little more off the statue the world had built for Page. For someone who had once stood at the front of the wave, it felt as if the wave had rolled on without him. When Page was asked, directly or indirectly, about the new school of guitarists, his answers were often careful, vague, or tinged with a cool distance. He talked about taste, he talked about feel, he talked about how speed and flash could never replace soul and atmosphere. To the casual listener, those comments sounded measured. To the people reading between the lines, they sounded like a man drawing a border between his kind of guitar and Eddie's. Because to Jimmy Page, guitar was about mystery, tension, space between the notes. To Eddie Van Halen, it was about pure energy, explosive joy, the thrill of discovering what else the instrument could do if you refused to accept its limits. Those two visions didn't have to be enemies, but in the minds of fans, they often were. Guitar magazine covers became battlegrounds, with taglines like, "Who really changed rock guitar?" and "From Page to Van Halen, the evolution of a hero." Every headline like that was a quiet reminder. There was before Eddie and after Eddie. As the years rolled on, Eddie remained vocal about his respect for the giants who came before him. The story wasn't one of open war or public insults. It was something subtler and, in some ways, more painful. For Jimmy Page, the hurt lived in the comparisons, in the way people spoke about Van Halen's technique as if it made the old magic obsolete, in the way new generations looked at Eruption the way the previous one had once looked at A Stairway to Heaven. Page didn't rage in public. He didn't start shouting matches in interviews. Instead, he did what he often did with the guitarists who unsettled him the most. He turned away. He rarely engaged deeply with Van Halen's revolution in his own words. He chose silence, distance, and a kind of quiet refusal to step into the ring that fans kept drawing around them. And in that silence, the tension grew. Because Eddie Van Halen wasn't just another guitarist on the scene. He was the proof that the instrument could move on without Jimmy Page at the front of it. That, perhaps more than anything, was what stung the most. Eddie may never have been Page's enemy in his own heart. But in the story of Jimmy Page's private resentments, he was the prodigy who arrived like an earthquake, shaking the ground beneath everything Page had built, and Eddie Van Halen was still not the final name on that list, because the next guitarist didn't just challenge Jimmy Page's legacy, he stood for an entire movement that seemed to throw the old gods of rock off their thrones with 3 chords and a sneer. Number 5, Ritchie Blackmore. The mirror Jimmy Page hated looking into. This rivalry wasn't born out of one insult, one stolen bandmate, or one bad night. It started with something far more dangerous for 2 proud, obsessive men: constant comparison. By 1970, Deep Purple's In Rock and Led Zeppelin's records were shaking the same walls across Europe. Fans, critics, and musicians couldn't resist lining them up side by side. Same country, same era, same towering guitar presence at the center of the storm. On one side, Jimmy Page, on the other, Ritchie Blackmore. Both were private, both were perfectionists, both believed the guitar was a weapon if you knew how to aim it, and from the very beginning, people would talk about one by bringing up the other. And the comparisons came fast. One musician later recalled, in pubs, backstage rooms, and cramped studios, you'd hear the same conversation over and over again. Who's really the better guitarist, Page or Blackmore? Those conversations burrowed under Page's skin in a way few things could. There's a story from 1971 that musicians still whisper about. Jimmy Page was at Delane Lea Studios when someone decided to play a Deep Purple track over the big speakers. The room filled with Ritchie Blackmore's sharp, dramatic lines, every note dripping with attitude and showmanship. Engineers and musicians in the room didn't say anything at first. They just listened. And then, almost as one, they slowly turned to see how Page would react. Page sat there, expression tight, cigarette between his fingers, staring at the console. When the track ended, someone asked him, half joking, "So, what do you think?" Page exhaled, shrugged, and delivered a line that cut deeper than any obvious insult. He dismissed Blackmore's playing as theatrical, overdone, like a performance that cared more about being seen than being felt. It was a small remark, but everyone in the room understood exactly who he was aiming at, because that was the thing Jimmy Page despised most about Ritchie Blackmore's style. To him, it felt like guitar as theater. To Blackmore, that theater was the entire point, and Blackmore was no softer in return. In a German radio interview around 1974, Ritchie Blackmore was asked about Led Zeppelin. He laughed while talking, the kind of casual, amused laugh that says more than any carefully chosen words. He hinted that Zeppelin's playing was sloppy, unfocused, more about noise and bombast than precision. He suggested, without saying it outright, that Page's legendary studio wizardry often masked messy playing underneath. For a man like Jimmy Page, who lived and breathed for what happened in the studio, those comments landed like a punch to the ribs. Their Cold War peaked in 1974 at Musicland Studios in Munich. Blackmore walked in unexpectedly to visit a producer. Jimmy Page was already there, hunched over the mixing desk, deep into his own work. The moment Blackmore stepped through the door, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The musicians and engineers froze. They knew the history. They knew the interviews, the digs, the comparisons. For one long, heavy moment, Page and Blackmore were in the same room, breathing the same tense air. Witnesses say Page slowly straightened up, stubbed out his cigarette, and without a word, walked out. No handshake, no greeting, no polite small talk between two legends who supposedly respected each other. Just silence, and a door closing behind Jimmy Page. Everyone in that studio understood exactly what that gesture meant. These weren't two friendly rivals. They were two men who refused to share the same space because doing so would mean confronting the uncomfortable truth that they were, in many ways, reflections of each other. Private, obsessive, perfectionists, allergic to compliments, terrified of being overshadowed. The truth is, Jimmy Page and Ritchie Blackmore were too similar for comfort. And sometimes, the people we can't stand the most are the ones who remind us a little too much of ourselves. Ritchie Blackmore was the final guitarist on Jimmy Page's private list, the last name in a quiet history of resentment, rivalry, and wounds that never really healed. In the end, this list was never really about 5 guitarists. It was about one man, a boy who grew up obsessed with sound, a session player who lived in the shadows while others stood in the spotlight, a band leader who rebuilt rock from the ground up, and then had to watch the same world he changed move on without him. Eric Clapton, Jimi Hendrix, Keith Richards, Eddie Van Halen, Ritchie Blackmore. On paper, they are just names, legends, fellow masters of the instrument. But for Jimmy Page, each one became something else. Clapton was the first wound the moment he realized that being brilliant wasn't always enough. The smirk in the club, the Yardbirds, Jim Gordon walking out the door, the line about effects and fingers on the BBC. Clapton was the reminder that the world could choose someone else as its god and never look back. Hendrix was the storm that blew in from nowhere, the American fire that turned shows into rituals and made Page feel for the first time like he might be yesterday's news. The man who burned his guitar while the crowd howled, who made London feel small, who left behind a hole so big that even a silence couldn't fill it. Hendrix was the proof that sometimes genius arrives and leaves before you ever learn how to live with it. Keith Richards was the sneer across the room, the voice of the purist who believed Page was doing it all wrong. The man who thought rock and roll didn't need cathedrals of sound, only 3 chords and the truth. His digs about echo, volume, and no feeling cut deeper because they came from someone who had survived the same era and chosen a different path. Eddie Van Halen was the earthquake, the young prodigy who showed the world that the guitar still had new secrets to reveal. The tapping, the speed, the fearless joy. He didn't insult Jimmy Page. He didn't have to. Every kid in every guitar shop trying to copy Eruption instead of Stairway to Heaven said enough. Eddie was the future knocking on the door, and Page knew he couldn't answer it the same way. Ritchie Blackmore was the mirror, the one man whose shadow felt uncomfortably similar to his own. Private, perfectionist, moody, brilliant, surrounded by stories of temper and obsession. When Blackmore sneered at Zeppelin's sloppy playing, and Page walked out of that Munich studio without a word, it wasn't just 2 rivals avoiding each other. It was one reflection refusing to look at another. In every one of these men, Jimmy Page saw a different version of himself, what he could have been, what he almost became, what he never wanted to turn into. That is why, at 81, the wounds still feel real, because behind the riffs and the myths, behind the posters and platinum records, these weren't gods standing on mountaintops. They were human beings trapped in the same tiny, suffocating space. Comparison. Who's better? Who's faster? Who's more soulful? Who really changed the game? Fans argued. Magazines made lists. Journalists poked at old scars with carefully worded questions. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, Jimmy Page learned an ugly truth about being a legend. The world that lifts you up will one day ask who replaced you. Maybe that's why he never answered back with open war, no public screaming matches, no years-long media feuds, no detailed confessions of hatred. Instead, he chose silence, cold nods, closed doors, and 1,000 tiny ways of saying, I don't want to be in the same room as that man. From the outside, it looks like bitterness. From the inside, it looks like a human being trying to protect what little of himself he still owns after giving so much of his soul to the guitar. Because for Jimmy Page, the real battle was never on magazine covers or in interviews. It was in hotel rooms at 3 a.m., in studios that smelled like tape and dust, in the quiet moments when the amps were off and the only thing left was the question, did I do enough? Today, people still argue about who the greatest guitarist of all time really is. Some say Hendrix, some say Clapton, some say Page. Others say it's none of them, because greatness isn't something you can measure on a list. But if you strip away the noise, you're left with something simple and strangely comforting. The rivalries fade, the resentment softens, even the sharpest quotes get lost in time. What remains are the notes, the opening of Stairway to Heaven, the fire of Hendrix at Monterey, the swing of Keith Richards on Jumpin' Jack Flash, the shock of hearing Eruption for the first time, the drama of Highway Star and Child in Time. Long after the men are gone, the music still lives, and maybe, just maybe, that's the one thing Jimmy Page and every guitarist on his secret list would actually agree on. In the end, it doesn't matter who won. What matters is that, for a brief, savage, beautiful moment in history, they all pushed each other higher than any of them could have climbed alone. If you're still here, listening to these stories, don't let them end with you. Tell us in the comments, whose side were you really on? Team Page, Team Clapton, Team Hendrix, Team Richards, Team Van Halen, Team Blackmore, or all of the above? And if you want more untold rivalries, secret grudges, and the human stories hiding behind rock's greatest myths, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss what we reveal next.